Dialect leveling. A dialect leveling refers to the assimilation, mixture and/or eradication of certain dialects, often due to language standardization. Dialect leveling has been observed in most languages with large numbers of speakers after the industrialization and modernization of the area or areas in which they are spoken. Definition of dialect leveling. Dialect leveling has been defined as the process by which structural variation in dialects is reduced, the process of eliminating prominent stereotypical features of differences between dialects. A social process consists in negotiation between speakers of different dialects aimed at setting the properties of, for example, a lexical entry. The reduction of variation between dialects of the same language in situations where speakers of these dialects have brought together. The eradication of socially or locally marked variance in conditions of social or geographical mobility and resultant dialect contact, and the reduction of structural similarities between languages in contact, of which interference and convergence are really two manifestations. Leonard Bloomfield implicitly distinguished between the short-term process of accommodation between speakers and the long-term process of leveling between varieties, and between the social and the geographical dimensions. On the geographical dimension, leveling may disrupt the regularity that is the result of the application of sound laws. It operates in waves but may leave behind relic forms. Dialect leveling and mischung, or dialect mixing, have been suggested as the key mechanisms that destroy regularity and the alleged exceptionlessness of sound laws. Dialect leveling is triggered by contact between dialects, are often due to migration, and has been observed in most languages with large amounts of speakers after the industrialization and modernization of the area or areas in which they are spoken. It results in unique features of dialects being eliminated and may occur over several generations until a stable compromised dialect develops. Quote, "It is separate from leveling a variation between dialectal or vernacular versions of a language and standard versions." Motivations. Contact leading to dialect leveling can stem from geographical and social mobility, which brings speakers from different regions and social levels together. Adolescents can drive leveling as they adapt their speech under the influence of the peers rather than the parents. In 20th century British English, dialect leveling was caused by social upheaval leading to larger social networks. Agricultural advancements caused movement from rural to urban areas, and the construction of suburbs caused city dwellers to return to what were formerly rural areas. World Wars I and II brought women into the workforce, and men into contact with more diverse backgrounds. Role of dialect leveling in Creole formation. It has been suggested that dialect leveling plays a role in the formation of Creoles. Dialect leveling is responsible for standardizing the multiple language variants produced by the relexification of substrate languages with words, for the lexifier language, features that are not common to all of the substrata and are therefore dissimilar across the different varieties of the emerging Creole, tend to be eliminated. This process begins when the speakers of the Creole community stop targeting the lexifier language and start targeting the relexified lexicons, that is, the early Creole. Dialect leveling in such a situation may not be complete, however. Variation that remains after dialect leveling may result in the reallocation of surviving variants to new functions, such as stylistic or social markers. Quote, or differences between substrata, including between dialects of a single substratum, may not be leveled at all, instead persisting as differences between dialects of the Creole. Case studies. Leveling in New Zealand English. New Zealand English is likely the newest native variety of English in existence. English was brought to the islands in 1800 but became influential only in the 1840s due to a large-scale migration from Britain. The most distinctive part of the language is the formation of the accent that has developed through complex series of processes involving dialect, contact between different varieties of British English, followed by dialect mixture. Although New Zealand English sounds very similar to Australian English, it is not a direct transplant, as Australians were only 7% of the immigrants before 1881, and the majority of the linguistic change in New Zealand English happened between 1840 to 1880. The speed with which New Zealand English became a unique, independent form of English can be attributed to the diversity of speakers coming into contact through colonization. Features from all over the British Isles and the Maori people that had inhabited the island for 800 years prior to colonization can be identified in the form New Zealand English has taken. Rudimentary leveling in New Zealand English occurred around 1860, the result of contact between adult speakers of different regional and social varieties and the accommodation that was required from the speakers. In face-to-face interaction, settlements attracted people from all walks of life and created highly diverse linguistic variation, but there were still families that lived in almost total isolation. Thus, the children did not gain the dialect of the peers as was normally expected but instead maintained the dialect of the parents. Speakers who grow up in this type of situation are more likely to demonstrate intra-individual variability than speakers whose main source of influence is the peers. When the emerging dialect stabilizes, it is the result of a focusing process, which allowed for a very small amount of regional variation. New Zealand English is largely based around the typology and forms of southeastern England because of the leveling out of demographic minority dialect forms. Triadical suggests that situations that involve transplantation and contact between mutually intelligible dialects lead to the development of new dialects. By focusing on specific qualities from the variants of the different dialects and reducing them until only one feature remains from each variable, the process may take an extended length of time. Reduction then takes place as the result of group accommodation between speakers in face-to-face interaction. Accommodation may also lead to the development of interdialectal forms, forms that are not present in contributing dialects but may be the result of hyperadaptation. Vowels variables have been maintained through the process of leveling, such as the vowels of foot and strut indicate a system of 5 rather than 6 short, checked vowels, a feature common in working-class accents in most of England north of the Bristol Channel, an area that encompasses about half of England's geography and population. However, only one consultant had this feature, indicating that it was likely a minority feature in adults that was then exposed to children. A has leveled from realizations all over an utterance to being found in front realizations only. Closed variants are more common in the recordings, rather than the open variants of Northern England, Scotland and Ireland. The fact that the close variants have survived suggests an influence from Southeast England, Australia and Scotland. Diphthong shift is equivalent to diphthongs from Southern England to the West Midlands. The majority of diphthong shift happens along O, starting at a point that is close to, or I, starting farther back than A, /. New Zealand rounding patterns are highly characterized by the rounding tendencies in Southern England. For example, the unrounded vowel found in lot is, as opposed to, and the fact that the rounded version disappeared is credited to the fact that those who used the rounded variant were a small majority. Consonants per hour dropping did not survive in New Zealand English, and the merger of with and is only now beginning to emerge. Irish English dental t and d have been levelled out in New Zealand English in favour of theta and th. Dialect leveling in Limbo. In this case study, Hinskins researches dialect leveling in the Dutch province of Limbo. Based on his findings, he argues that dialect leveling does not necessarily lead to convergence towards the standard language. The research for this case study takes place in Rimburg, a small village on the southeast of Limburg, where Riparian dialects are spoken. The southeast area of Limburg experienced rapid industrialization at the turn of the 20th century with the larger-scale development of coal mining. This created several job opportunities, which led to considerable immigration to the area, which in turn led to language contact and a diversification of language varieties. This is the area where most of the dialect leveling occurred. Geographically, the dialects of Limburg are divided into three zones. The westernmost zone has East Limburg dialects spoken. The easternmost zone has Riparian dialects spoken. The central zone is a transition zone between the two varieties. As one travels from west to east, the dialect's features deviate more and more from the Dutch standard language. Additionally, the dialect features accumulate from west to east, and features found in East Limburg dialects are also found in Riparian dialects, but not the other way around. In this study, 21 dialect features from all three zones were analyzed. A few of the dialect features of the following: t, dilation, which is typical to all three zones; derivational suffix l, which marks the A-B zone dialects; post-lexical weakening, which is typical of the dialects in the A zone. The study found that the ratio of dialect features showing overall loss to dialect features investigated decreases with increasing geographical distribution. In other words, the wider the distribution of the dialectal feature, the less likely TGE that it will level with the standard language. For example, dialectal features found in all three zones, such as t, dilation, were maintained, while features such as the post-lexical weakening, only in the Riparian dialects, were lost. Of the 21 features that are analyzed, 14 resulted in a loss of a dialect feature. Some of the features that were leveled did not lead to convergence toward the standard language, and in some cases, there is even divergence. One feature that is a marker for only the Rimburg dialect, which occurs in the A zone, is the non-palatalization of the epenthetic per second in the diminutive suffix. Rimburg dialect is in the process of adopting the morphophonemics of the surrounding B-zone dialects, rather than standard Dutch. Dialect leveling in this case cannot be explained in terms of convergence with the standard language. The findings of the study conclude that dialect leveling resulted from accommodation. Accommodation and dialect leveling should be understood in the light of the continuous struggle between the tendencies towards unification on the one hand and those towards particularism and cultural fragmentation on the other. Those who spoke the same dialect were part of the in-group, and those who spoke a different variety were part of the out-group. Based on conversation data, Hinskins found that the more typical, unique a dialect feature is for a speaker's dialect, the larger the relative number of linguistic conditions in which the use of this dialect feature is suppressed in out-group contact situations. Accommodation, or suppression of dialect features, then facilitates mutual comprehension and results in the convergence of dialect features. Standard German, urbanization and standard language. The emergence of a standard German has been a rather complicated process due to the fact that no single, indigenous German dialect has ever had extreme prestige. Only recently have dialectic forms attained attained a level of prestige to ultimately attain conformity. The move towards standardization truly started after 13th century Franciscans began a push toward the creation of a literate public, although 70% of the materials printed were in Latin as opposed to German. 14th century city dwellers were far more parochial than the poetic forebears, although there were some linguistic links within the realm of commerce, as newer cities would look to established cities for law codes, and the Hanseatic League, in the north of modern Germany, developed a form of German specifically for business. However, there was a disruption of any chance of linguistic unity as discoveries from the Atlantic shifted focus to Hamburg and Bremen, weakening the Hanseatic League. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the language underwent a massive phonological shift, and the changes established a still viable linguistic features at present. East Middle German found itself geographically in the center of the changes and became a linguistically uniform area, which set it apart from other parts of the German-speaking world that remained linguistically distinct. The Viennese imperial chancellery introduced spelling reforms that were similarly influential. Although most regions had their own systems they wished to adhere to, which resulted in 5 forms of printer's language, all languages that the printers used in the publications. The largest influence in the 16th century was Luther. Although he did not create a language or a dialect, the majority of his work was done in language of the Upper Saxon Chancellery, which he was able to use because it was very close to his native dialect. Because of the prestige of said language, his work was more widely accepted. He was also able to influence the lexicon, both in choice of vocabulary and semantic selections. Because so many people read his work, the orthography began to stabilize, and with that a canonical standard German corpus of sorts developed, though this was fairly limited to the Protestant North. Even despite the religious differences between the North and South, it was the existence of East Middle German that truly prevented the initial spread of Luther's linguistic forms. This divide was overridden in the Protestant parts of Middle Germany, as the prestige of Luther's dialect assured the acceptance of features from East Middle German. The differences were further reduced as the need for coherent written communication became paramount, and East Middle German, now highly identified with Luther, became the linguistic medium of the North. The displaced Low German, once the first language of the region and a subject for instruction, became used only in comedic theatre, where it was used only by important figures. This shift allowed the language societies to further modify the language in the 17th century by translating any Latinate compounds through Germanic morphemes, at such a level to be understood by any German-speaking child. Grammarians developed a body of usage within the canonical corpus which was evaluated and used to monitor the use of the language. It was at this time that the GE prefix for non-auxiliary past participles was regularized. The middle of the 18th century produced a slew of northern writers who would ultimately shape the interaction between Catholic Germany that had resisted Luther's linguistic influence and the rest of the German-speaking world, which directed the path that language development would take. The South did not have any literary geniuses to combat this sudden emergence in the North, and thus the most influential literary minds of 2 generations all happened to speak Lutheran-influenced dialects. In 1871, after centuries of highly variable spelling and punctuation, a conference was called to finally create a semblance of uniformity within German spelling, enforced through the publication of a Bavarian dictionary in 1879 and a Prussian in 1880. Jacob Grimm and Rudolf von von Raumer created controversy in the 19th century, as they proposed opposing criteria for which spelling should be based. Grimm claimed that history and etymology should determine spelling, while van Raumer claimed that spelling should be based on pronunciation. Grimm's historical case has found its way into the orthography, as there are two spellings of final p, t, tx, depending on the surrounding environments. Van Raumer's case for a phonetic-based orthography is recognized in the principle that, if you can pronounce it, you can spell it; if you can read it, you can pronounce it. Quote, any sort of standard pronunciation, therefore, was heavily reliant on standard writing. Dialect leveling in Denmark and Sweden. Christensen and Thielander discuss two socio-dialectal investigations, one Danish and one Swedish. The paper suggests that the development of urban society together with an increasing degree of publicness were mentioned as important non-linguistic causes of the accelerating dialect leveling witnessed in this century. For example, heavy migration from the countryside to towns and cities increased traffic and trade. Longer schooling within a more centralized system of education, the spread of mass media and other kinds of technological development, may all be factors that explain why the process has been more rapid during the 20th century than it was in the 19th, or why leveling hits dialects of certain regions harder than dialects elsewhere. Dialect leveling in African American Vernacular English. In this case study, Anderson discusses dialect leveling of African American Vernacular English spoken in Detroit. In her research she analyzes a very particular linguistic variable, the monophthongization of I before voiceless obstruents. While monophthongization of the diphthong R and GTA is common in AAVE, it generally occurs in the environment of voiced, not voiceless, obstruents. For example, a southern speaker of AAE would pronounce the word tide as and pronounce the word tight as, whereas some southern white speakers would pronounce it as. The monophthongization of I before voiceless obstruents is a salient characteristic of southern white dialects such as Appalachian and Texas varieties of English, and in the southern states it indexes group membership with southern whites. To the north, however, in Detroit, this linguistic feature does not mark group membership with whites. Anderson presents evidence that this linguistic marker has been adopted among speakers of AAVE in Detroit due in part to contact with white Appalachian immigrants. In other words, the diphthongization of I before voiced obstruents, which is a common feature of AAVE, has been leveled with that of southern white dialects and is now being pronounced as a monophthong in this environment. In order to understand why this leveling has taken place, it is important to understand the demographics and social dynamics of Detroit. In her article, Anderson reports that black and white segregation in Detroit is at a higher level than in any other American city. She describes the demographics, stating that the overwhelming majority of whites have moved to the suburbs while most local African Americans reside in the inner city of Detroit. White Appalachians who have migrated to Detroit have found refuge in the inner city and have maintained close ties with African Americans. This is due in part to the cultural orientation to the South, but also because both groups have been marginalized and have been subject to discrimination. The contact among these groups has led to the leveling of AAVE with a southern white variety in which speakers of AAVE have adopted the monophthongization of I before voiceless obstruents. In the South, this linguistic marker indexes group membership between blacks and whites, but in the North this linguistic marker no longer serves this use since white Detroiters do not use this feature in the speech. Anderson concludes that the overall effect is that Detroit AAVE aligns with the Southern vowel system for the I vowel variable. people, including that of the Detroit Southern white community, while indexing in opposition with Northern whites. Mandarin tonal leveling in Taiwan. A study of Mandarin leveling in Taiwan investigated the tonal leveling of Mandarin between Mandarin Huaishangren and Holo-Benchangren in Taiwan. The results indicated that the tonal leveling of Mandarin between these two ethnic groups started one generation earlier than the general patterns suggested by Trudgill. This leveling has nearly reached its completion in the following generation, taking approximately 30 years. 4 factors were proposed to interpret the rapidity of this dialectal leveling: the intensiveness of immigration to Taiwan, the exclusive Mandarin-only language policy, the pre-established social order and infrastructure during the Japanese colonial period, the frequent contacts between Huaishangren and Benchangren,